done. The reconstruction is complete. The year is 865 Anno Domini. Shadows are emerging along the low, fog-shrouded shores of East Anglia. These are not the fishing boats of the local inhabitants, nor the cumbersome merchant vessels of the Franks. Their long, slender hulls and predatorily curved bows, crowned with the heads of dragons and serpents, are alien to these waters. They glide over the waves with a silent menace, heralding the end of the world for those who watch from the shore. An unknown, lethal danger has arrived. These are the longships of the Great Heathen Army, their striped sails resembling the wings of colossal birds of prey. In the cold cells of the monasteries, the monks are not yet aware that their world is about to be reduced to dust, that the parchments, embellished with gold and azure, will be trodden into the mud, and the sacred relics will become the plunder of invaders. Their labor, their faith, their entire existence devoted to the transcription of sacred texts, is condemned to be consumed by the flames that are already being fanned by the winds of the English Channel. But the peril does not only hang over the monasteries. The Anglo-Saxon kings, mired in dynastic conflicts and trivial disputes, continue their feasts in their mead halls, oblivious to the impending tempest. The peasants, their backs bent against the autumn wind, do not yet hear the thud of hooves that will obliterate their harvest. They are unaware that this force has come not merely to pillage, but to annihilate their laws, their faith, their entire world. This is not a raid, it is a deluge, poised to engulf everything. This army has come for more than just gold and slaves. It has come for land. It has come to seek vengeance for the death of its legendary chieftain, Ragnar Lothbrok. A loathing for the crucified god of the Southerners and the cold wrath of the northern belief in Odin and Thor are the driving forces behind these warriors. Like a hammer suspended over an England fractured into 7 kingdoms, they are preparing to demolish this world. A war of total annihilation is at hand. In the years to follow, this hammer will almost eradicate the Anglo-Saxon civilization, leaving behind but a single, bleeding fragment. And at this very moment, in the westernmost of the kingdoms, in Wessex, a 16-year-old youth is coming of age. He is of frail health and lacks the stature of a warrior. Instead of a sword and shield, his hands are more accustomed to holding scrolls of psalms. He is the very antithesis of the hero that this world needs. The name of this young man is Alfred. He is the youngest of the king's 5 sons, and no one, not even he himself, envisions him as a future sovereign. Yet, it is this pensive scholar who is fated to stand in the path of the all-consuming fire. It is his name that will become a byword not only for resistance, but also for the wisdom and rebirth of an entire nation. The genesis of a legend was foreordained by destiny, though no one was yet aware of it. But before he can achieve greatness, he is destined to endure long, bloody years of humiliation, defeat, and despair. This is the narrative of how a sickly intellectual, pushed to the very precipice of destruction, will be transformed into the most eminent king of his epoch. This is the account of a man who discovered within himself the fortitude not merely to survive, but to lay the groundwork for a new nation. This is the chronicle of the birth of England, forged in fire and blood. Prior to the arrival of the Great Army, the land we now call England was a patchwork of warring kingdoms. This era is known as the Heptarchy, or the Rule of 7. Kingdoms rose and fell, absorbing one another in a ceaseless struggle for the title of Bretwalda, the supreme ruler of all the Anglo-Saxons. Political instability was the norm, and unity was non-existent, even when confronted with a common threat. By the middle of the 9th century, 4 principal powers had emerged from this chaos: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the center, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the southwest. All of them had been established by Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who had arrived in the lands of a waning Roman Britain several centuries before. Each of these kingdoms possessed its own dynasty, its own culture, and its own aspirations, rendering their conflict inevitable. Anglo-Saxon society was rigidly hierarchical. At its pinnacle was the king, whose authority was founded on 2 principles: the sacred, his lineage from the pagan god Woden, and the practical, his capacity to generously remunerate his warriors. This is why one of the monarch's most crucial functions was that of the ring giver, the dispenser of rewards and lands in exchange for loyal service. However, the king was not an absolute monarch. His power was circumscribed by the White Nagemat, a council of the wise, composed of the highest nobility, the ealdormen, and the bishops. Without their approbation, the ruler could not enact laws, declare war, or levy taxes. He was more of a first among equals, whose primary responsibilities were the defense of the kingdom from external adversaries and the preservation of internal order. A complex system of checks and balances was in place. The king's military strength was contingent on 2 forces. His personal guard, the herd, was made up of professional warriors bound to him by an oath of fealty. For a major conflict, the fyrd was convened, a national militia. The backbone of both society and the army was constituted by the ceorls, free peasant landowners who were ranked just below the nobility. They were the very foundation of the Anglo-Saxon world. The lives of these people were arduous and entirely dictated by the agricultural seasons. Their world was confined to a small village with wooden dwellings and communal fields. News from the outside world was brought only by itinerant merchants and royal emissaries. At the lowest level of society were the slaves, or theaus, prisoners of war, debtors, or those who had been born into servitude. Society was simple and agrarian. The economy of this world was almost exclusively based on agriculture. Wealth was gauged not by the jingle of coins, but by the extent of land, the number of livestock, and the people who labored upon it. Cities as we conceive of them were virtually non-existent. There were either fortified administrative centers, known as burhs, or small trading ports like Lundenwich, the future London. Wool and tin were exported from these places, while Frankish swords, wine, and glass were imported. The principal force that unified this fragmented society was the Christian faith. By the 9th century, it had almost completely supplanted the old paganism. The process, which had commenced at the end of the 6th century, with the mission of Augustine of Canterbury from the south and the efforts of Irish monks from the north, was now complete. The sanctuaries of the ancient gods had been razed, and their names had been consigned to oblivion. Christianity had become the spiritual bedrock of the Anglo-Saxon world. In the place of pagan shrines, monasteries had arisen, which had become not only spiritual centers, but also hubs of culture and economic activity. It was here that manuscripts were transcribed, chronicles were maintained, and the most magnificent works of art, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, were created. As proprietors of vast tracts of land, the monasteries had amassed legendary treasures, golden chalices, silver crosses, and reliquaries. It was this very opulence that rendered them the primary targets for the northern marauders. The initial Viking raids, which commenced at the close of the 8th century, were akin to painful, yet not lethal, mosquito bites. However, in the year 793, the sacking of the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. This event served as a sinister harbinger of the impending age of terror. The Vikings' strategy was predicated on the element of surprise. Their longships would materialize as if from nowhere. Their warriors would disembark, plunder, kill, and then vanish before the local ealdorman could even assemble the militia. The Anglo-Saxons, failing to comprehend the nature of this new menace, interpreted these raids as a form of divine retribution for their transgressions, and were almost entirely defenseless against these lightning-fast assaults. Having become accustomed to waging wars amongst themselves, which were conducted in accordance with a certain set of rules, the Anglo-Saxons were now confronted with an adversary who acknowledged no rules at all. But the army that arrived in 865 was not merely a band of merciless brigands. It was a vast, organized force whose objective was not the acquisition of temporary spoils, but permanent conquest, the conquest of land. Upon their landing in East Anglia, the Viking army received an unforeseen advantage. The local king, Edmund, in a fatal miscalculation, chose not to engage in combat, but instead to buy them off, providing the invaders with horses. Having thus acquired mobility, the army proceeded to capture York, the capital of Northumbria, a kingdom already rent by civil war in the year 866. The first of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Mercia was the next to be targeted. In 867, the Vikings seized Nottingham. The king of Mercia, Burgerid, and his ally, King Ethelred the Great of Wessex, combined their forces, but even their united strength was insufficient to retake the city. Mercia was compelled to accept a humiliating peace. The Second Great Kingdom was now effectively under the dominion of the invaders. By the early 870s, the ancient kingdoms had fallen in succession. Their kings had been either slain or exiled, their lands partitioned among the Danes. Only Wessex, the last bastion of the Anglo-Saxon world, continued to offer resistance. All eyes, filled with a mixture of dread and fading hope, were turned towards its ruling dynasty, towards the 4 sons of King Ethelwulf, and among them, towards the young prince, Alfred. For Alfred, who had only just reached adulthood, this signified the end of the world as he had known it. The clamor of collapsing kingdoms was drawing ever nearer to the borders of his home. The tranquil world of scholarly discourse and ancient manuscripts was disintegrating before his very eyes. Childhood was over. What lay ahead was war, a war for the very survival of his people. In order to comprehend the man he was, we must journey back to his childhood, a time spent in a world that had not yet been touched by the horrors of invasion. Alfred was born in the year 849 at a royal estate. He was the 5th and youngest son of King Ethelwulf and his wife, Osburh. It was during this period that the defining traits of his character, piety, intelligence, and an indomitable will, were forged. As the youngest of 5 sons, Alfred's prospects of ascending to the throne were virtually non-existent. Ahead of him in the line of succession were his 4 elder brothers. It is probable that from a young age he was being prepared for a career in the church, a path for which his piety and insatiable thirst for knowledge would have made him eminently suitable. He was destined not for a secular, but for a spiritual life. However, Alfred's entire childhood was blighted by a mysterious and agonizing ailment. His biographer, Bishop Asser, makes mention of an affliction that tormented the king throughout his life, manifesting in sudden onsets of acute pain. Modern medical historians have postulated that this could have been Crohn's disease. This unceasing battle with his own body played a pivotal role in the shaping of his character. The constant physical pain forged within Alfred an extraordinary inner discipline and strength of will. Being unable to distinguish himself in martial pursuits, he sought strength in another domain, that of books. It is likely that his physical frailty was the primary catalyst for his passion for learning, a passion that was fervently encouraged by his mother, Queen Osburh. The infirmity of his body gave rise to an indomitable spirit. The renowned anecdote recounted by Asser serves as a perfect illustration of his character. Queen Osburh presented her sons with a lavishly illustrated book of Saxon poems, promising it as a gift to the one who could first commit the text to memory. While his elder brothers, preoccupied with hunting and games, paid no heed to the offer, the young Alfred sought out a tutor, memorized the verses, and was awarded the coveted book. From his earliest years, his defining characteristics were his determination and his intellectual curiosity. The most significant event of his early years was a journey to Rome. In 853, at the age of 4, Alfred was dispatched by his father to the Eternal City. This was no mere pilgrimage. The deeply devout King Ethelwulf sought, by this means, to fortify the ties between Wessex and the Papal See. In Rome, a mysterious event transpired. Pope Leo XIV received the young prince and, as the Anglo-Saxon chronicle attests, consecrated him as king. Historians continue to debate the significance of this act. It is more probable that it was not a coronation, but a ceremony of confirmation, during which the Pope conferred special honors upon the boy, perhaps symbolically bestowing upon him the title of Roman consul. In 855, Alfred once again journeyed to Rome, this time in the company of his father. The year-long sojourn left an indelible mark upon him. Although 9th-century Rome was but a pale imitation of its former imperial splendor, for the young prince it was, above all, the sacred city of the apostles, the epicenter of the Christian world, the repository of the spiritual authority and wisdom to which he so fervently aspired. On their return journey, they sojourned for several months at the court of the king of the West Frankish kingdom, Charles the Bald. It was here, in his encounter with the legacy of the Carolingian Renaissance, that the young Alfred beheld the ideal of a Christian sovereign, not merely a warrior, but a wise, erudite, and pious monarch. This was the image that he would endeavor to personify decades later. During the absence of the king and his son, a political crisis erupted in Wessex. The eldest son, Ethelbald, apprehensive that his father's new wife might bear him rivals for the throne, instigated a rebellion. In order to avert a civil war in the face of an external threat, the sagacious Ethelwulf took an unprecedented measure. He partitioned the kingdom, ceding the superior, western portion to his rebellious son. Following the death of Ethelwulf in 858, his sons, in a bid to preserve stability within the kingdom, reached an agreement to inherit the throne in succession. Ethelbald reigned until 860, and Ethelbert until 865. In the year that the Great Heathen Army made its landing, the third brother, Ethelred, ascended to the throne. It is at this juncture that Alfred's public life commences. He is bestowed with the official title of Secundarius, or the recognized heir to the throne. At the age of 16, Alfred becomes the second most powerful figure in the state. The years that he had dedicated to the study of the Psalter were now at an end. He was now compelled to study a different book, the Book of War, a tome inscribed in iron and blood. The frail youth, who had dreamed of the tranquility of a library, is now forced to don armor and take his place in the shield wall alongside his brother, to defend his kingdom from the encroaching darkness. But his true education was only just commencing. The most brutal and significant lessons were yet to be learned on the blood-drenched fields of battle, beneath a sky obscured by the smoke of burning cities. The merciless and sanguinary school of war awaited him. The year 871 has been recorded in history as the Year of Battles. It was during this year that the full force of the Danish invasion was unleashed upon Wessex. For the 22-year-old Alfred, it was a year of bloody apprenticeship, a year in which the pious prince was transformed into a battle-hardened commander. This year would irrevocably alter both him and the destiny of his kingdom. In the span of 12 months, the Saxons and the Danes clashed in 9 major engagements and a myriad of smaller skirmishes. The fields of Wessex were liberally drenched with the blood of both sides. The fate of the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom hung precariously in the balance, a thread that grew ever more tenuous with each successive battle. At the close of 870, the Viking army crossed the Thames and penetrated into the very heart of Wessex. Their objective was no longer plunder, but outright conquest. They established a formidable fortified camp at Reading, at the confluence of the rivers, a strategic position from which they could launch raids and maintain the initiative. The enemy had secured a pivotal location. The Danes were under the command of the seasoned and ruthless kings, Bagsec and Halfdan. In response, King Ethelred and his brother Alfred acted with the utmost celerity. They immediately summoned the Wessex militia and advanced to confront the foe. The forces of both sides were poised for a decisive encounter. The first significant clash occurred at Englefield. A contingent of Saxons, led by a local ealdorman, launched an attack on a party of Viking foragers and emerged victorious, slaying one of the Danish jarls. While a minor tactical success, it held immense moral significance, bolstering the army's spirits and demonstrating that the Vikings were not invincible. However, emboldened by this success, Ethelred and Alfred committed a grave error. 4 days later, they attempted to storm the main Viking encampment at Reading. The assault proved to be a catastrophic failure. The Danes executed a ferocious sally and utterly routed the Saxons. The hero of the previous engagement, Ealdorman Ethelwulf, was among the fallen. It appeared that Wessex was doomed, but it was in this moment of desperation, a mere 4 days after the crushing defeat, that the Saxons regrouped and once more confronted the main Viking army. One of the most celebrated battles in Anglo-Saxon history was about to unfold, the Battle of Ashdown. Confident of victory, the Danes had secured a tactically advantageous position atop a hill, dividing their army into 2 divisions. At the foot of the hill, the Saxons had also divided their forces. One division was commanded by King Ethelred, the other by his younger brother, Alfred. The enemy held a clear advantage, but there was no room for retreat. And at this critical juncture, as Bishop Asser recounts, something peculiar occurred. While the Danes were forming up for the attack, King Ethelred was in his tent, attending Mass. He rebuffed all entreaties to commence the battle, declaring that he would not join the army until the service was concluded, for the service of God was of greater import than the service of men. The Danes had already begun their descent from the hill, threatening to encircle Alfred's force. The prince was confronted with a stark choice: to retreat and suffer dishonor, or to initiate the battle without the king's command, thereby violating the chain of command. He made his decision. Asser writes that, like a wild boar, Alfred led his division in a desperate charge up the slope. A savage and bloody conflict ensued. Attacking uphill, from a tactically inferior position, the Saxons, spurred on by the valor of the young prince, crashed into the Viking shield wall. This was not merely a clash of 2 armies, it was a collision of 2 worlds, Christian warriors fighting for their faith and their land, and pagans who were confident in the protection of their gods. It was only when the battle was at its height that King Ethelred arrived on the field with his forces. The combined Saxon armies fell upon the enemy with renewed ferocity. The battle raged until nightfall, until at last the Viking line faltered. A panicked retreat began. The Danish losses were staggering. King Bagsec and 5 of their most illustrious jarls were slain in the battle. The Battle of Ashdown was Alfred's baptism of fire. He had demonstrated his mettle not only as a courageous warrior, but also as a decisive commander who had assumed responsibility at a critical moment. However, the euphoria of victory was to be short-lived. The Danish army had not been annihilated. Having been reinforced, the enemy was thirsting for vengeance. The war was far from over. 2 defeats swiftly followed. In the bloody Battle of Merton, King Ethelred sustained a mortal wound and succumbed to his injuries shortly after Easter. And so it was that in April of 871, in the very midst of the war, against a backdrop of unceasing defeats, the 22-year-old Alfred, the 5th son of the king, ascended to the throne. He became king in circumstances that were utterly devoid of hope. He inherited a crown and a kingdom that had been bled dry by war. The army was decimated, the treasury was depleted, and the enemy was at the gates. His very first battle as king, at Wilton, culminated in yet another defeat. The hero of Ashdown was compelled to take the humiliating step of paying the Vikings a tribute to induce them to depart. But this was not a surrender. It was a desperate and sagacious measure, one that was necessary to purchase time. Time to tend to wounds, to reconstruct the army, to muster strength, and to make preparations for the next, even more dreadful, round in the struggle for survival. It was merely a tactical hiatus. Following the payment of the tribute, a fragile and deceptive calm descended. Having received the money, the Danes redirected their attention to the last remaining kingdom besides Wessex, Mercia. They expelled King Burgred and installed a puppet ruler on the throne. The Great Heathen Army then divided, and the enemy commenced a process of regrouping. One faction, under the leadership of Halfdan, proceeded north to Northumbria, with the intention of permanently settling in those lands and establishing the Scandinavian Kingdom of York. The other faction remained in the south, under the command of a new, cunning, and ambitious leader by the name of Guthrum. He began to amass his forces, biding his time for the opportune moment, to deliver a decisive blow against Wessex. Alfred utilized these few years of peace to the fullest extent. He did not remain idle, but instead drew lessons from his past defeats. He came to the realization that the traditional militia, which was summoned for only a short duration, was ineffectual against the professional detachments of the Vikings. The army required a radical overhaul in order to be prepared for the conflict that lay ahead. The king began to experiment with defensive strategies, creating small, mobile units. He also came to recognize the paramount importance of controlling the sea. In the year 875, Alfred's small fleet achieved the first naval victory in English history over the Vikings. However, despite this significant success, all of these measures were still far from adequate. In 876, Guthrum violated the truce. In a swift maneuver, he captured the fortified town of Wareham. Alfred blockaded him and compelled him to enter into negotiations. Guthrum swore upon the sacred ring of Thor, the most inviolable oath for a pagan, that he would depart from Wessex. But, as events would prove, even the most sacred of oaths were but empty words to the Vikings. Having received the ransom, the Danes, under the cover of darkness, treacherously slew the Saxon horsemen and broke through to Exeter. Alfred once again blockaded them within the city, and this time, nature itself came to his assistance. A Viking fleet of 120 ships, which was en route to reinforce Guthrum, was caught in a violent storm and was completely destroyed. Deprived of his reinforcements, Guthrum was forced to surrender. On this occasion, Guthrum took an oath on Christian relics and did indeed depart from Wessex. Alfred and his beleaguered kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief. It seemed as though the danger had passed. But in reality, this was merely a prelude to the most catastrophic disaster that had ever befallen the Anglo-Saxon world. Guthrum had not relinquished his ambitions. He had merely altered his tactics. He had come to the realization that the army of Wessex, fighting for its homes, was a formidable adversary to defeat in open combat. And so, he resolved to strike not at the army, but at the very will of the Saxons to resist. The enemy was preparing to deliver a crushing psychological blow. In January of 878, in the dead of winter, immediately following the Christmas festivities, Guthrum's army launched a blitzkrieg. In violation of all the unwritten rules of warfare, at a time when no one anticipated an attack, they descended upon the royal residence at Chippenham, where Alfred and his court were celebrating the Epiphany. The enemy had struck at the very heart of the kingdom. The blow was so sudden and overwhelming that it precipitated a complete collapse. The royal court was scattered. The guards were slain. Alfred himself, with a small contingent of bodyguards, managed to make a miraculous escape. In a single night, the mighty King of Wessex was transformed into an exile and a fugitive in his own land. He had lost everything. The governmental structure of Wessex crumbled. Many ealdormen were either killed or submitted to the Danes. A portion of the populace fled across the sea in a state of panic. The militia, demoralized and bereft of its leader, dispersed. Alfred had lost his army, his treasury, and his capital. He had lost his kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon state in the south of England had ceased to exist. All that remained to him was his own life, and a handful of his most loyal warriors. The darkest and most desperate chapter of his life had begun. Pursued by his enemies, the king was forced to seek refuge in the impenetrable forests and marshes of Somerset, finding his last sanctuary on the diminutive, swamp-enveloped island of Athelney. The Isle of Athelney was a desolate and inhospitable sanctuary, shielded on all sides by treacherous marshes and dense thickets. It was here, within a small, hastily erected fortification, that the king of the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the savior of his people, existed as a hunted creature, having plummeted to the very nadir of his fortunes. It is to this period that the renowned legend of the cakes is attributed. While in hiding, Alfred sought refuge in the humble dwelling of a swineherd. The swineherd's wife, oblivious to the king's identity, requested that he watch over the cakes baking in the oven. But Alfred, consumed by somber reflections on the fate of his kingdom, failed to notice them burning, for which he was severely berated by the peasant woman as a slothful and worthless vagabond. Although this tale, chronicled centuries later, is in all likelihood a fabrication, it holds an immense significance in the popular conception of Alfred. It serves to humanize him, portraying the monarch at a moment of profound humiliation, when a common woman can reprimand him for his inattentiveness. This legend symbolizes his descent to the very depths and his empathetic connection with the tribulations of his people. But life at Athelney was not merely a time of humiliation, it was a period of guerrilla warfare. From his marshy redoubt, Alfred and his small band of followers launched audacious raids, attacking Viking detachments and Saxon collaborators. It was a desperate struggle for survival, yet its primary objective was to prevent the last flicker of hope from being extinguished. He was broken, but he was not vanquished. In the solitude of the marshes, in the abyss of his despair, Alfred was already orchestrating his comeback. He clandestinely dispatched emissaries to the few ealdormen who had remained steadfast in their loyalty, exhorting them to prepare their men and to await his signal. He was acutely aware that he would be afforded but one opportunity for a final, decisive battle for the future of England. The winter of 878 marked the nadir, the lowest point in his destiny. But, as is so often the case in the annals of history, It is in the deepest darkness that the most brilliant dawn is born. In the spring of 878, Guthrum and his army regarded themselves as the undisputed masters of Wessex. They had partitioned the land, levied tribute upon the Saxons, and were ruling from their seat of power in Chippenham. They were confident that the war was concluded, that all resistance had been quelled, and that King Alfred was either deceased or had permanently fled the country. The enemy was absolutely certain of their ultimate triumph. But they were mistaken. In the marshes of Athelney, the smoldering embers of resistance were already igniting into a conflagration. And at this very juncture, an event transpired that served as the first glimmer of hope. Another Viking army, under the command of Ubba, the brother of the legendary Ivar the Boneless, had landed on the coast of Devonshire with the intent of crushing the last vestiges of resistance. The Vikings laid siege to the Saxon fortress of Sinwit. The situation of its defenders, led by Ealdorman Oda, was desperate. The fortress was poorly fortified and lacked a source of water. Seeing no alternative to a dishonorable surrender, Oda and his men resolved to undertake a suicidal sortie. At dawn, they launched their attack upon the enemy. The surprise assault was met with an incredible degree of success. The Danes, caught unawares, were utterly routed. Ubba himself was slain in the course of the battle, but most significantly, the Saxons captured the most sacred of Viking relics, their war banner, which depicted a raven and was believed, according to legend, to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok himself and to foretell the outcome of battles. The news of this unexpected and symbolic victory rapidly disseminated throughout Wessex and reached Alfred's sanctuary. This was the signal for which he had so long been waiting. The victory at Sinwit had demonstrated that the spirit of the people was not broken, and that the Vikings, even the most formidable among them, could be vanquished. The time for action had come. Alfred initiated the most perilous phase of his plan. Clandestine messengers carried his call to arms throughout the kingdom. All loyal men were instructed to assemble at a designated place and time. The 7th week after Easter, at the ancient megalithic site of Egbert Stone, on the border of 3 shires, where resistance still smoldered. The general muster had been declared. The choice of location was a stroke of genius. It was situated far from the main Viking garrisons, but more importantly, it possessed immense symbolic significance. The stone served as a reminder of Alfred's grandfather, King Egbert, the first ruler to have united the greater part of southern England under the dominion of Wessex. It was a summons to a revival of former unity and greatness. On the appointed day, contingents of militiamen began to converge on Egbert's stone from the forests and hills. These were the remnants of the Fyrds, Thagans, and free Sea-Orls, who, at great personal risk, had responded to the call of the king they had long believed to be dead. And when Alfred, alive and unharmed, appeared before them, their joy, as the chronicle records, knew no bounds. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes this moment with a stark, yet incredibly potent brevity. The people received him as one who had risen from the dead and were filled with great joy. This was not merely the reunion of an army with its commander. It was an act of national rebirth, a nation that, having lived in fear and humiliation, had once again found its leader, its symbol, and its hope. Alfred addressed the assembled host. He spoke of the perfidy of the pagans, of the desecrated churches, and of the humiliation of his people. He appealed to their courage, to their faith in God, and to their duty to defend their families and their land. He promised them not an easy victory, but a glorious battle that would determine the destiny of their people for generations to come. Having assembled this final army of Wessex, Alfred did not hesitate for a single day. The element of surprise was his greatest weapon, for Guthrum was as yet unaware of the scale of the uprising. On the following day, the army set out, making a halt at a place called Islay, where the last detachments of militiamen joined their ranks. The army was now prepared for the march. According to Acer, Alfred experienced a vision of Saint Neo during the night, in which the saint foretold his imminent victory. And at dawn, scouts brought word that Guthrum's main army was in close proximity, near a place called Edington, and, having taken up a position on the slope of a hill, was preparing for battle. The enemy had been located, and victory had been divinely prophesied. Guthrum, at last comprehending the magnitude of the threat, realized that it was now too late. He could not retreat without losing face before his warriors, and was thus compelled to accept battle. Alfred led his army, which had risen from the ashes, to meet its destiny. Under the ancient banners of Wessex, emblazoned with the image of a golden dragon, they marched into their last and decisive battle. In the eyes of these men, who were marching into battle behind their resurrected king, there burned a fire that the Vikings had not yet witnessed. It was the fire of desperation, which had been transmuted into an indomitable resolve. They were men who had nothing left to lose. Everything, their lives, their faith, their future, was contingent on the outcome of this single engagement. The Battle of Edington in May of 878 stands as a pivotal moment in the history of England. It was not merely a battle, but the culmination of a protracted struggle for survival, a decisive confrontation between two civilizations. A defeat would have signified the end of an independent Anglo-Saxon England. A victory offered the sole, final opportunity for a renaissance. As had been the case at Ashdown, the Danes had secured a tactically advantageous position on the crest of a hill. But on this occasion, Alfred's army was of a wholly different character. These were not simply militiamen, but men who had been united by a common adversity and a shared hope, led by a king whom they regarded as a messenger of God. Their morale was at a level that was unprecedented for the Saxons. Alfred arranged his army in the traditional and formidable shield wall. The warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping to form a solid barrier from which, like the quills of a hedgehog, long spears protruded. In the foremost ranks stood the most seasoned thanes and household troops, clad in mail and helmets, and behind them, the common sea orals. It was a living, breathing fortress. Alfred understood that his only chance of success lay in withstanding the enemy's initial, most ferocious onslaught, and in drawing them into a grueling battle of attrition. The battle commenced. Emitting their renowned, blood-curdling war cry, the Vikings surged down the slope like an avalanche, and, with all the ferocity of berserkers, crashed against the shield wall. The initial moments of the engagement were a veritable inferno. The din of axes and swords striking shields was audible for many miles. The shield wall shuddered and buckled under the monstrous assault, but it held firm. Warriors in the front ranks fell, but their places were immediately taken by others from the rear ranks. The Saxon wall had withstood the onslaught. Alfred himself, as Acer attests, fought with ferocity and tenacity at the very heart of the battle, side by side with his men. He inspired them by his personal example, demonstrating that the king shared with them the full burden of the conflict. This was not a battle of strategists, but a brutal hand-to-hand struggle in which fortitude, endurance, and courage were the deciding factors. The battle raged for several hours without respite. The Vikings' offensive momentum, which had been shattered against the indomitable resistance of the Saxons, began to wane. Their fury had been exhausted. And at this very juncture, sensing the enemy's weakness, Alfred gave the command to counterattack. The enemy was spent, and the Saxons launched their offensive. Slowly, but inexorably, With the weight of its mass, the shield wall advanced up the slope. The Vikings, unaccustomed to such tenacious resistance, wavered. Their formation became disordered. And then, as the chronicle records, God granted him the victory. The Danish line broke, and they fled in a panicked, disorderly rout. On this occasion, Alfred did not repeat the error he had made after the Battle of Ashdown. He did not afford the enemy an opportunity to recover. The Saxons initiated a relentless pursuit, harrying the Vikings all the way to their fortified encampment at Chippenham. Those who managed to reach the fortress, including Guthrum himself, found themselves ensnared in a deadly trap. Alfred did not attempt to storm the camp. He initiated a systematic, ruthless siege. His army encircled the fortress, destroying all the crops and seizing all the livestock in the vicinity. After 2 weeks, famine had set in within the camp. The will of the Vikings was broken. The once proud conqueror, Guthrum, was compelled to sue for peace. And at this juncture, Alfred demonstrated his qualities not merely as a great military commander, but also as a sagacious statesman. He could have ordered a massacre, but he understood that the annihilation of one army would not resolve the problem. Others would come to replace Guthrum. He sought not vengeance, but a lasting and durable peace that would secure his kingdom for all time. He proposed to Guthrum terms that were stringent, yet magnanimous. The principal condition was the demand that Guthrum and his most illustrious warriors embrace Christianity, with Alfred serving as his godfather. Furthermore, England was to be partitioned by the old Roman road. The lands to the east of this road would remain under Danish control and would come to be known as the Danelaw, the region subject to Danish law. 3 weeks later, Guthrum and 30 of his chieftains arrived at Alfred's camp, where the sacrament of baptism was administered. The Viking leader was given the Christian name of Ethelstan, and his recent mortal enemy, King Alfred, became his godfather. This symbolic act served to welcome Guthrum into Alfred's family and to make him a vassal. Following this, the Danish king sojourned for 12 days at Alfred's court in Wedmore. There, they celebrated this event, and the treaty was sealed with the exchange of lavish gifts, as custom dictated. Peace between the two peoples was finally concluded. The Treaty of Wedmore represented a triumph of Alfred's diplomacy. He had not merely vanquished the enemy on the field of battle, he had neutralized him ideologically. By transforming Guthrum from a pagan chieftain into a Christian king, he had rendered him a predictable neighbor. The war for survival had been won, but Alfred knew that this was merely the beginning. The victory at Edington had afforded Alfred the precious commodity of time, and this time he was determined to utilize it to reconstruct and fortify his kingdom so that it would never again find itself on the brink of annihilation. The anvil of Edington had forged a victory. Now, the task of crafting a sword and shield for its defense commenced. Despite the peace, Alfred was acutely aware that the threat posed by the Danelaw and new bands of Vikings had not been eliminated. Consequently, the respite of nearly 15 years was for him not a period of repose, but one of revolutionary reforms. He embarked upon an intensive campaign to completely transform the defensive system of Wessex. Having learned the bitter lessons of 878, Alfred set himself a singular objective. His kingdom should never again be caught unprepared. To this end, he resolved to permanently alter the very military landscape of England by creating a deep, layered system of defense predicated on 3 key elements. The first and most crucial element was the system of boors, a network of fortified towns. While the concept was not novel, Alfred transformed it from a series of disparate endeavors into a comprehensive, mathematically precise, and nationwide strategy. He determined to blanket his entire kingdom with a network of impregnable fortresses. The principles of this system are detailed in the document known as the Burgle Hidage. This document provides a precise calculation of the number of men required for garrison duty for each of the 31 burhs. The method of calculation was brilliantly simple. 1 man for every 5.5 yards of wall. By knowing the perimeter, one could determine the requisite garrison size for each fortress with absolute accuracy. The burhs were strategically positioned so that any inhabitant of the kingdom was no more than a day's journey from a place of refuge. This created a system of defense in depth. In the event of a raid, the populace could swiftly seek shelter behind the walls, thereby depriving the marauders of their plunder, while the garrison could either repel the attack or hold out until the arrival of the main forces. The construction of the burhs was a monumental undertaking. They consisted of massive earthen ramparts, surmounted by a wooden palisade and encircled by a deep ditch. Within the walls, a strict grid of streets was laid out, with a market square and a church at the center. These were powerful and well-planned fortress towns. Over time, these burhs evolved into more than just military strongholds. They became administrative, economic, and ecclesiastical centers, thereby stimulating trade and the resurgence of urban life, which had all but vanished after the departure of the Romans. Thus, in addressing a military necessity, Alfred inadvertently laid the foundations for the medieval English town. The second thrust of the reform was the reorganization of the inefficient militia. The traditional fyrd was convened for only a short duration, and the warriors were always eager to return to their agricultural labors, which made it impossible to conduct protracted campaigns. Alfred resolved this issue by dividing the entire militia into 2 divisions, so as to ensure a state of constant combat readiness. Now, 1/2 of the army would be on active duty, either in garrisons or in the field, while the other half could peacefully attend to their farms. After a predetermined period, they would exchange roles. This simple yet ingenious innovation had profound consequences. For the first time in the history of Wessex, a standing army had been created. This reform enabled Alfred to transition from a strategy of passive defense to one of active operations. He could now impose his will upon the enemy, conduct lengthy sieges, and carry out protracted campaigns without the fear that his army would disperse to their homes. Furthermore, he preserved and strengthened the core of the army, the detachments of professional warrior thans. The third, and perhaps most innovative element of his defensive strategy, was the creation of a fully fledged navy. He was the first of the English kings to grasp this simple truth. In order to defeat the Vikings, it was necessary to engage them on their own terms, at sea. Their ships had to be intercepted before they could land their forces on the shore. Having recognized this, in the 880s, Alfred commenced the systematic construction of the first Royal Navy in the history of England. Alfred's ships, which were constructed according to his own design, were larger, faster, and had a higher freeboard than the Viking longships. They were equipped with up to 60 oars, and their primary objective was not boarding, but ramming and sinking enemy vessels. This was a fundamentally new type of warship, created for the purpose of achieving total maritime supremacy. The crews of these ships were of a mixed composition, comprising not only Saxons, but also Frisian mercenaries, who were regarded as the finest sailors of that era. Patrolling the English Channel, this fleet became a formidable deterrent. It is therefore not surprising that Alfred is rightfully hailed as the father of the English Royal Navy. By the close of the 880s, Wessex had been completely transformed. From a vulnerable, constantly assailed kingdom, it had evolved into a formidable military power. It was now protected by a triple ring of defense, a navy at sea, a network of burhs on land, and a standing, reformed army. Alfred had created a military machine that was without parallel in Western Europe. He did not merely replicate the enemy's tactics. He creatively reimagined them and devised a system that surpassed anything the Vikings could bring to bear against him. And very soon, this shield, which King Alfred had so painstakingly forged, was destined to undergo its most rigorous test of strength, when a new, even more terrifying wave of invaders arrived from across the sea. But for Alfred, the victory over the Vikings was not merely a military objective, but a spiritual one as well. In his profoundly religious consciousness, the invasion of the pagans was a divine chastisement, visited upon his people for their cardinal sin, the pervasive ignorance and catastrophic decline of learning that had afflicted all strata of society. He observed with sorrow that kings and nobles had ceased to value education, that the once great monasteries had fallen into a state of decay, and that the clergy were so illiterate that the majority of priests were incapable of even comprehending the meaning of the Latin service they were conducting, and consequently, they were unable to elucidate it to their flock. In the preface to one of his translations, Alfred recalls with a sense of grief the golden age of Anglo-Saxon scholarship. He lamented that by the time of his accession to the throne, education had declined to such an extent that south of the river Humber, there were scarcely any individuals remaining who were capable of competently translating a simple letter from Latin into their native tongue. As soon as the military threat had abated, Alfred, with the same indomitable energy that he had applied to the construction of burhs and the fleet, set about the implementation of his most ambitious program, a program for the revival of education. He was profoundly convinced that in order to save England, it was necessary to save its soul by transforming the people into a wise and Christian nation. His initial step was to establish at his court a circle of distinguished scholars. However, as it was almost impossible to find educated individuals within Wessex itself, he was compelled to assemble his think tank from all corners of England and even from beyond its borders. This endeavor has been recorded in history as the Alfredian Renaissance. He extended invitations to scholars from Mercia, such as Plegmund, who would later become the Archbishop of Canterbury. He summoned scholars from the continent. But the most pivotal figure in this circle was Asser, a monk from Wales, who would subsequently become a bishop, the king's closest advisor, and his personal biographer. It is through his work that we have come to know so much about Alfred. Alfred presented this council of scholars with a twofold objective. Firstly, to elevate the standard of education among the clergy and the nobility. He even promulgated a decree stipulating that all sons of free men were to be instructed in literacy in their native Anglo-Saxon language. This was a decision that was unprecedented for that epoch, a veritable breakthrough. Alfred himself, who was by now almost 40 years of age, despite the burdens of state affairs and his chronic illness, personally dedicated himself to the study of Latin in order to be able to lead this process. Asser records that the king always carried with him a small book of Psalms, which he would read in any spare moment, thereby setting an example for his subjects. But the second and most revolutionary component of his program was a project that was without precedent in all of medieval Europe. Alfred initiated and personally participated in the translation of the greatest works of Christian thought from Latin into Old English, in order to make them accessible to all who were not proficient in Latin. At a time when Latin held undisputed sway on the continent, Alfred was, in effect, creating a literary Anglo-Saxon language. He was endowing it with the capacity to express the most complex, philosophical, historical, and theological concepts, thereby laying the groundwork for the entirety of future English literature. Under his guidance, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, a manual for priests, was translated. He dispatched copies of this translation to all the dioceses, with each book being accompanied by a precious reading pointer, and estelle. The renowned Alfred jewel, which was unearthed by archaeologists, is in all probability one of these very pointers. Orosius's History Against the Pagans was also translated. And in this endeavor, Alfred acted not merely as a translator, but as an editor and co-author. He appended his own chapters to the text, which included a description of the geography of Germany and the invaluable accounts of two travelers, the Norwegian Ohthere and the Anglo-Saxon Wulfstan, who had journeyed to the White Sea and the Baltic coast. In addition, translations were made of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a foundational work that shaped the self-perception of the Anglo-Saxons, and of Alfred's own favorite philosophical work, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, as well as St. Augustine's Soliloquies. In addition to the translations, it was during Alfred's reign that the disparate monastic annals were compiled into a single national chronicle, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Maintained in Old English from the perspective of the Wessex dynasty, it became not only an invaluable historical source, but also a potent instrument of propaganda, which served to create a shared historical memory. Alfred's cultural renaissance was not the arbitrary fancy of a scholarly monarch. It was a well-conceived state policy. By creating a unified literary language, a common history, and shared cultural values, he was laying the ideological groundwork for a future, unified English nation. The walls and ships protected the body of the kingdom, but wisdom and faith protected its soul. He was convinced that an educated populace would make for better warriors and more loyal subjects. He therefore waged war on two fronts, with the sword against the external enemies, the Vikings, and with the pen against the principal internal enemy, ignorance, which he regarded as the root of all evil. And his victories on this second, cultural, front proved to be no less significant and enduring than all of his military triumphs. By the close of the 880s, the defensive system of Wessex appeared to be flawless. But on the continent, a new tempest was brewing. A vast army of Vikings, having suffered a defeat in Francia, now turned their gaze towards England, which, during the years of peace, had grown both wealthy and strong. It was precisely this wealth that rendered Wessex a coveted prize. Deprived of the opportunity to plunder the continent, the Vikings resolved to test the mettle of the kingdom that they had once almost succeeded in destroying. In 892, a coordinated invasion by two separate armies was launched. A colossal fleet of 250 ships, under the command of the renowned chieftain Hásteinn, made landfall in northern Kent. Almost simultaneously, a second fleet of 80 ships entered the estuary of the Thames. This was a well-conceived two-pronged assault designed to disperse the Saxon forces. Furthermore, the Vikings of the Danelaw, in defiance of all their oaths, broke the peace and joined the invaders in the hope of securing easy plunder. For Alfred and his kingdom, the most severe ordeal of his entire reign had commenced. The blow had been struck simultaneously from three different directions. The war that ensued over the next 3 years was of a fundamentally different character from its predecessor. It wasn't a war that would be decided by a single, decisive battle, but a grueling, mobile war of attrition, which was waged over a vast expanse of territory. It was this conflict that would serve as the true test for the entire defensive system that Alfred had so meticulously constructed. Alfred immediately took up a position with his field army between the two Viking encampments in order to prevent them from uniting their forces. He chose not to launch a frontal assault on their fortifications, but instead to adopt the sagacious tactic of a blockade, thereby wearing down the enemy and depriving them of the ability to maneuver. And during this time, the system of bursts functioned to perfection. Their garrisons successfully repelled all attempts by small Viking detachments to penetrate into the interior of the country in search of provisions. The populace was secure, and the marauders were repeatedly forced to return to their camp empty-handed. Recognizing the futility of these raids, Hásteinn executed a swift dash to the west. However, he was immediately intercepted by the Saxon army, which was under the command of a new generation of military leaders, Alfred's son, Edward, and his son-in-law, Ethelred, the ealdorman of Mercia. At Farnham, the Saxons overtook the Vikings and inflicted a crushing defeat upon them. But while they were engaged in blockading the remnants of Hásteinn's army, alarming news arrived. The Vikings from the Danelaw, taking advantage of the situation, had laid siege to the strategically important Burh of Exeter in the west. Alfred immediately marched his army to the west in order to relieve Exeter. At the same time, the Danes from the second encampment made a desperate dash across the entirety of England. However, the local militia, the Fyrd, independently assembled, attacked them, and put them to flight. This series of events serves as a perfect illustration of the genius of Alfred's system. While the king and his field army were engaged in addressing the primary threat, the garrisons of the burhs and the local militias were independently dealing with localized threats. The enemy was unable to gain a foothold at any point. They were constantly being attacked and pursued. The war continued. In one of its episodes, the Vikings laid siege to a fortress on the river Lea. It was then that Alfred employed a cunning engineering stratagem. He ordered the construction of two smaller fortresses further downstream and had the river blocked, thereby trapping the entire enemy fleet. Realizing that their ships were ensnared, the Vikings abandoned them and fled. By the year 895, they were completely exhausted. 3 years of grueling warfare had yielded them nothing but losses. Their tactic of swift raids had proven to be utterly ineffectual against a deep, layered defense. The enemy had been vanquished not by force, but by a system. In the summer of 895, the Great Invasion concluded in a complete and utter failure. A portion of the Vikings returned to the Danelaw, while another contingent sailed back to Francia in search of easier spoils. The victory in this long and arduous war was a triumph of Alfred's strategic genius. He had won it not through a single, brilliant battle, as he had at Edington, but through a system, through patience, and through superior organization. He had created a kingdom that was capable of defending itself. The burhs, the reformed Fyrd, and the fleet, all the components of his military machine had functioned precisely as he had intended. Wessex had not merely survived. Following this victory, it was transformed into the undisputed leader and protector of all the Anglo-Saxons, becoming the most powerful state in Britain. The final years of Alfred's life were passed in a state of relative tranquility. This time, he dedicated to the continuation of his educational endeavors, as well as to the strengthening of the justice system and the restoration of the country, which had been devastated by many years of war. The long-awaited period of creation had at last arrived. He promulgated his renowned code of laws, known as the Book of Dooms. In this work, he did not create new laws, but rather collected and systematized the most just statutes of his predecessors. The code commenced with the 10 Commandments, thereby emphasizing that all human law should be founded upon the law of God. This was yet another step towards the creation of a unified legal space. Alfred the Great passed away on the 26th of October, 8999, at the age of 50. His long and agonizing struggle against external foes and his internal malady had come to an end. He was interred in his capital city of Winchester, in the cathedral that was later rebuilt to become the New Minster Abbey, which he himself had founded. His legacy is of colossal proportions. In the most literal sense, he saved Anglo-Saxon civilization from complete annihilation. Had Wessex fallen, the entirety of England would have become Scandinavian, and its language, culture, and faith would in all likelihood have simply vanished. Alfred single-handedly halted this process and reversed the course of history. He not only preserved what had been, but also laid the foundations for the future. It was he who secured the foothold from which his son, Edward, and his grandson, Ethelstan, were able to launch a counter-offensive, reconquer the Danelaw, and, for the first time in history, unite all of England under the rule of a single king. He was a great military reformer. His innovations, the system of burrs, the reorganization of the army, and the creation of the navy, were to define England's defensive strategy for a century to come, proving that a well-conceived system can vanquish any foe, no matter how formidable. He was a great enlightener. His program of translations saved the Anglo-Saxon language as a language of high literature and administration. It is thanks to him that not only his own works have been preserved for us, but also the greatest monuments of Anglo-Saxon poetry, such as Beowulf and his Chronicle, became the foundation of all English historiography. But perhaps his most significant legacy is the very ideal of the Christian king, which he embodied throughout his life. He combined within himself qualities that would seem to be irreconcilable: the courage of a warrior and the wisdom of a scholar, the piety of a monk and the foresight of a statesman. His life became a model for emulation for centuries to come. It is noteworthy that the epithet, the Great, was bestowed upon him not by his contemporaries, but much later, in the 16th century. The English reformers were searching in their national history for heroes who had asserted the distinctiveness and independence of England, and in Alfred, they found such an ideal. From that time forth, he has been an enduring symbol of English courage and wisdom. The assessment of his activities by historians is almost unanimously positive, and even with all possible caveats, such as the idealization on the part of his biographer, the sheer scale of his personality, his will, and his achievements remains absolutely undeniable. He is rightfully considered to be one of the greatest monarchs in history. He inherited a kingdom that was on the brink of total collapse and left behind him the most powerful, well-organized, and culturally advanced state in Britain. He literally transformed ruins into an indestructible power. The story of Alfred is not merely the tale of a king who won a few important battles. It is an epic saga of how one man, guided by faith, intellect, and an indomitable will, in the face of imminent destruction, was able not only to survive, but also to lay the foundations of a great nation that endures to this day. He was the king who, in the darkest hour of his people's history, did not permit the light of civilization to be extinguished, and this light, which he preserved and augmented, continues to burn through the centuries, a reminder of the fragile scholar prince who became a hammer to his enemies, a shield for his people, and the founding father of England. Alfred's legacy is a testament to an indomitable will. If this chronicle of the king who forged a nation has resonated with you, subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support enables us to bring to light new and monumental stories. Until next time.